Welcome to the Diplomat Podcast, providing you with big ideas and expert analysis of our planet, its places, and its people. I'm your host, Thomas Kensington. Antarctica is the only continent in the world for which we know the name of the first human to lay eyes upon it. This historical event occurred 200 years ago this year, in 1820, when a Russian expedition under the command of Fabian Gottlieb von Bellinghausen first sighted ice likely connected to the Antarctic landmass. To celebrate the bicentennial of this event, we are talking with Dr Alessandro Antonello. My guest is a senior research fellow at Flinders University, located in Adelaide in southern Australia. Dr Antonello currently holds a grant for a project titled An International Environmental History of the World Ocean, 1950s to 2000s. The project, looking into the ways in which states, international organisations and international communities have engaged with and conceptualised the world ocean as a natural environment from 1950s to 2000s. In 2019, he also released a book entitled The Greening of Antarctica, Assembling an International Environment. Dr. Antonello, welcome to the podcast.
First of all, I thought it would be a great foundation to the podcast if we just started by fully outlining the unique status of the continent and what the dictates of the international treaties are, what states can and cannot do on Antarctica.
Sure. Antarctica is a very curious place because it has a strange territorial framework that 7 countries claim territory in Antarctica, but most countries don't recognise that those claims or that indeed sovereignty could be claimed over any part of Antarctica. And so today, Antarctica is governed through an international regime known as the Antarctic Treaty System, the ATS. So if I say ATS, I'm talking about the Antarctic Treaty System. This began in 1959 with the signing of the Antarctic Treaty itself, which came into force in 1961. That treaty was really about trying to guarantee peace and international harmony as well as encouraging scientific cooperation in Antarctica. Now, just to give a really brief history of why the 12 original signatories felt they needed to sign that treaty in 1959, there's sort of really three precipitating factors. One is that, as I mentioned, 7 countries claim territory in Antarctica. So Australia, Argentina, Chile, France, Norway, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Essentially, no other country recognises those claims. And in fact, 3 of those claims, those of Britain, Argentina, and Chile, overlap on the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the area of Antarctica south of South America. And there had, in fact, been actual shots fired between Argentine and British, officers in the early 50s. Nothing quite came of it, but, it was tense. So there was this territorial disagreement. The second big structure of the 50s, of course, is the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States facing off against each other for supremacy or hegemony in various parts of the world, if not the whole world. And this came to Antarctica because in the late 40s, there had been some attempt to resolve the territorial issues in Antarctica, but the Soviet Union said, no, you must include us. And then this linked with the third issue, which was the International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958. Now, the IGY seems like a very good thing. It was a very good thing, a massive international scientific program to study the Earth. The problem was that the scientists conducting this program didn't abide by the niceties of territoriality and sovereignty. So they just decided to go anywhere in Antarctica without asking permission. So this heightened the territorial issue. So these 3 issues, were a source of tension in Antarctica. Combined with, general thoughts, of a Cold War world where people were, frightened of geopolitical instability. And so this led to this agreement, the Antarctic Treaty, which guaranteed peace and scientific cooperation. There was a really novel legal aspect to the treaty, which makes it very unique amongst international law, but sort of essential to allow cooperation, and that's Article 4. And it says, during the period of force of the treaty, that no actions will further embed territorial claims, and that no action of recognition or non-recognition will be relevant during the currency of the treaty, which meant that, the 7 territorial claimants could sort of enter what was, a very positive treaty around peaceful relations. So the treaty also demilitarizes Antarctica and bans nuclear weapons, and to allow scientific cooperation. As it developed from its coming into force in 1961, the treaty system really took on a third essential pillar, which is environmental protection and management. As my own work has shown, this really, this starts from the very earliest times for various reasons and really increases in the first 3 decades. And so the Antarctic Treaty Parties add several other treaties or conventions, hence why we talk about a system now. Firstly, they sign a convention around seals in the early 70s, which basically manages the exploitation of seals in the waters around Antarctica. The next real major addition to the system was CAMLR, so the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. Much easier to say CAMLR. So that was signed in 1980 and came into force in 1982. And that manages the fisheries in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica. But it's not a regular fisheries convention. It's really focused on protecting the entire ecosystem. So it's quite a novel treaty as well. And then in the 1980s, there were thoughts that oil and minerals might be exploited in Antarctica. And so the treaty parties did negotiate another convention called the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities. That was signed in 1988, but for 2 really big reasons, a vociferous global environmentalist campaign. And then Australia and France refused, though they signed this convention, they all signed this convention. Australia and France said that they would refuse to ratify this convention. They wanted to ban mining. Now, Australia and France were very significant actors within the system. Both are territorial claimants. France is a major power. Australia is a kind of middle power of importance. And so this led to really the last plank of the system, the Madrid Protocol in 1991. And this is a comprehensive environmental protection regime for Antarctica. It institutes a lot of protections and management systems around how human activities go ahead in Antarctica. I'll make 2 other points about the structure that governs Antarctica. So what I've described is really this kind of the focused system for Antarctica, but the way in which Antarctica sits within other international treaties and frameworks is quite complex and ambiguous. And really the main one in which there's sort of inter-regime ambiguity is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is, essential to the management of the oceans. Only the United States hasn't ratified it. Basically every country, there are a couple of other minor countries who haven't really signed it. But it sort of interacts very ambiguously with the Antarctic Treaty System. And so partly because that's the way the Antarctic Treaty Parties want it, partly to manage those territorial issues. And the final point I would say is that it's not just states within the system, that the current Antarctic Treaty System has a couple of major non-governmental actors. One is the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, SCAR, which was founded before the Antarctic Treaty as an international body to coordinate scientific research in Antarctica. The second body is newer, from the 90s, called COMNAP, the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs. Most countries have official Antarctic research bodies, and through this non-government body, international non-government body, they manage the logistics, really nuts and bolts of how to operate in Antarctica. And they have standing in the Antarctic Treaty System because they're experts. And the other major body I'll mention first up here is IATO, the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, also created in the early 90s. Tourism is sort of perhaps forgotten element. Tourism is not the most obvious element of what needs to be governed in Antarctica from the outside if you don't know the system internally. And IATO is a voluntary body of tour operators, so private companies who work together as a way of managing tourism in a kind of, again, another ambiguously governed area.
One thing I just want to clarify, so you were saying that France and Australia refused to ratify a treaty concerning mining.
Correct.
It was my understanding that mining, that's what the treaty was supposed to ban mining, or what exactly were France and Australia objecting to that was not in the treaty?
Sure. So we need to clarify the flow of events in the 1980s. So through the 1980s, the Antarctic Treaty Parties were negotiating a convention to regulate mining. They didn't have any intention of banning mining in the 1980s. They created a system, a fairly complex system, with environmental protections, absolutely. I mean, the environmentalist campaign often portrayed that there wasn't environmental protections. So through the 80s, the convention that was signed in 1988 but never ratified was a system to govern access and benefits to minerals. So between 1988 and 1991 is when this new system came in. So the Madrid Protocol of 1991 is the instrument that bans mining in Antarctica. And we can, the details aren't so important, but there is a way in which Australia and France were, in a sense, reacting to very strong domestic campaigns, both up for re-election. So it's an interesting case in which international politics, it combines with domestic politics to produce sort of unexpected outcomes.
In a more general sense, if we see Antarctica as a testing ground for collective action and international institution building, what is your overall evaluation of the Antarctic system?
So I'm generally quite optimistic and positive about what the treaty system, what the regime has achieved and its ongoing effectiveness. Not only its effectiveness, but I think I'm also optimistic about its coherence and stability as well. I think, we'll get onto this in a bit, but there is currently a lot of discussion about how China and Russia are affecting that. Some others are more pessimistic than me. So why am I essentially broadly optimistic? Firstly, I would say that the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings, which are the annual meetings of the treaty parties, they have a fairly stable and quite technocratic agenda. So it's quite a technocratic system now. It wasn't as such in earlier decades. And in a sense, we can see that technocratic systems of this kind do have a certain internal logic and direction, which perhaps can allow them to withstand more obviously geopolitical outside shocks. So some aspects of this technocratic governance include each year, the Committee for Environmental Protection, which is one of the official bodies within the system, it's regularly creating or modifying or renewing protected areas. So a lot of work goes into making these plans for how certain areas of the Antarctic environment are managed. Who can go into them, at what times of year, what kind of vehicles or aircraft can go into areas. So, very technocratic stuff. There are, in Antarctic speak, they're comprehensive environmental evaluations, but in other countries we would call them environmental impact assessment. So there's a lot of analysis of how new developments, which are essentially all scientific stations, scientific infrastructure, how will they affect the Antarctic environment? It's, again, quite a technocratic area. There are things like heritage and historic areas. So every year there is, again, adding to or renewing the list of areas which are considered historic and need to be protected. Some include graves of people who've died in Antarctica, but other historic structures, like, for example, the huts that Robert Scott and Shackleton used. They are protected historic sites. Unlikely they'll ever be delisted, but, there's a kind of technocratic process which manages them. Connected to the protected areas, there are guidelines for tourists and visitors. Again, where can people go? What can they or can't they do in certain areas? So it's a fairly technical system, I would say. And when you look through the papers of the annual meetings, they're just a deluge of scientific work and these kind of technocratic elements. The geopolitics creeps in certain ways, but, it's a lot of scientists and technically trained officials discussing these environmental and scientific issues. In another part of the system, CAMLR, so the Fisheries Southern Ocean Body, that is perhaps the area of the Antarctic Treaty System which is most criticised at the moment, because there is a major environmental campaign backed by certain states, to create very large marine protected areas in Antarctica. And this campaign's been going almost a decade now, and the results are quite meagre, partly because Russia and China have been blocking these efforts within CAMLR. I suppose I'm optimistic, or at least sanguine, because CAMLR is not just a system to create protected areas. It has a range of other policy making and guideline making powers which do control fishing and the quality of stocks in Antarctica. I think some people would disagree with me, but for example, the krill fishery quota for the Southern Ocean is very conservative. Krill is an enormous potential fishery, but not much of it is taken. And so CAMLR does have power in that area. It has very technical things as well, like fishing gear, things like that. So I am optimistic that CAMLR is also doing a fairly good job. Within the ATS, I would say that, that third pillar of Antarctica, which is protecting the environment, I would say a lot of conservation and biological scientists are fairly happy with the progress of creating systematic protection. The other point I would make, which is not often made, is that the membership of the system is fairly stable. Most voting members of the ATS as it stands have been there since the late 1980s. So only a very small handful, 2 or 3 new players have really entered the system in recent years, and they're not really major countries. China, Russia, or China and India joined in the 80s, as did Brazil. So there are 3 giant countries already which were part of the system relatively early on. In the 1980s, there was an argument led by Malaysia that this was a rich white man's system. And the response of the ATS was to say, well, please join, please sign, and please participate. And I think it's arguable that all the major international players are part of the system now. So I don't think that's terribly much of a problem. There are problems, I think, or we can at least explore what the problems might be. One criticism I've seen, and which I'm sympathetic with, is that the system hasn't really had any innovation or renewal since the 1990s. So the Madrid Protocol, signed in 1991 and coming into force in 1998, was really the last moment of expansion and renewal in the system. So it's an interesting question of how a system might just get too stuck in a rut, maybe. Is that a problem? And how might that weaken rather than strengthen a system? I would say that the links to other parts of the international architecture are ambiguous and unclear. So, for example, climate change is arguably the biggest problem facing Antarctica, but the ATS is not the structure in which to reduce human emissions, even though, of course, all the biggest emitters are part of the ATS. But the question is, how could the ATS help with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? How could it work with that system? Another example there, a positive example, is how the International Maritime Organization created a polar code around the conduct of shipping activities in the polar regions. For example, mandating that certain lighter fuels be used. That's a good example of how another part of the international system had a good effect, still flowing through, but a good effect. I think tourism is a subtle problem, which I don't think people see as I'm not sure it will destabilise the whole system, but tourism is managed in an ambiguous way because the Antarctic Treaty System relies on its members to govern tourist activities. But the tourism codes are relatively superficial. I mean, they're still very strongly in favour of environmental protection, but we see that increasing numbers of tourists are they're not landing across the whole continent, they're landing at a very small amount of sites. And so a very small amount of sites are taking a big hit of environmental impact. I suppose the final problem I would at least put out there is the ATS too opaque? Is decision-making made behind closed doors too much? This is mostly a kind of public legitimacy question because, of course, all the state actors are behind those doors, so they are privy to the closed-door decision-making. So it's not like it's not like the members are somehow, partitioned and can't participate in the decision-making. So that's just a broader issue around public decision-making. So yeah, I think I'm broadly optimistic about the ATS, but it's clearly not a perfect system, and all systems need to be renewed and tinkered with to keep them going.
It's also very interesting about the effects of tourism. So just very quickly, so what just the effects of sheer kind of footfall and human waste and things like that? Is that the kind of the main problem?
I think last year, but just before COVID, the last summer season saw upwards of 70,000 visitors. So 70,000, of course, is a drop in the bucket of global tourism, when about 50,000 of those visitors will actually land on Antarctica. So ships carrying over, I think it's 500 passengers, can't land people. So that's one element of environmental governance there. But the Antarctic Peninsula is relatively accessible from South America. It's about 2 days sailing, whereas, of course, Antarctica to Australia is several weeks, 10, 12 days of sailing. And so in the Antarctic Peninsula, really a dozen sites are getting a lot of footfall. And, there is a question about how that affects very local environments. Remembering that Antarctica, an infinitesimally small amount of Antarctica is ice-free. Very small amount of Antarctica is rock on which animals can live. And so tourism is, when we think about it, if those 70,000 were spread across the entire continent, it would be a different matter. But they are going to a very concentrated amount of sites.
As you say, the kind of technocratic experts are getting on with their job despite or alongside the kind of high-level geopolitical posturing. In the Atlantic, they were saying that some of the scientific exploration is a guise is a guise for extending territorial claims. Could you say a little bit about exactly how that works? But also, given the previous question, what are the aims, I suppose, of of extending these territorial claims?
Sure. I mean, the issue with the claims is that it's an issue that has a very deep history, but has a very particular standing under law. So in terms of science as a guise for sovereignty, I mean, before 1959, naturally, all the territorial claimants sent scientists down there as a form of permanent occupation. So under international law, there are various ways in which you guarantee your sovereignty over land. And this is international law, which has morphed and changed over centuries. But in the first half of the 20th century, when all of the 7 existing claims were made, sending scientists to occupy a hut is one way in which you prove sovereignty. Scientists, of course, also come with benefits, like the knowledge that they produce. Somewhere like Australia does need meteorological stations in Antarctica to help, predict southern hemispheric climate patterns. That's a generally good thing that leads to good outcomes. There is one of the connections of the early 20th century is between sovereignty and whaling. Before whaling sort of moved entirely onto ships, whales had to be taken to a land base to be processed. There were never any on Antarctica exactly, but the British South Georgia, which is currently in the news because of the giant iceberg heading towards it, British South Georgia was the centre of the whaling industry in the first quarter of the 20th century when the whales had to be brought to shore. So there's a way in which good old-fashioned resource exploitation was at the heart of these claims. That's arguably why Norway has a claim in Antarctica. But in terms of currently, the short answer here is that I don't think that Russia or China is about to make a formal territorial claim over any part of Antarctica. But, this has several aspects to it. So I've already, mentioned how there is the territorial background before 1959. Notably, the Soviet Union, and Russia, we assume, has inherited this position, always reserved its right to claim territory in Antarctica. So it never said that it didn't recognise claims couldn't be made, sorry to use the double negative, but it always reserved its right. China, of course, the People's Republic of China was not recognised before the early 70s, and China joins the treaty system in the 1980s. So under the treaty, it's just legally impossible to make a claim. Or if they did make a claim, it would be entirely moot. It would certainly destabilise things, but it would be sort of, for the signatories of the Antarctic Treaty, would be a moot point. The second point, of course, is that mining is banned indefinitely under the Madrid Protocol. Your listeners may read in sloppier journalistic outfits that the ban ends 2048, so 50 years after the coming into force. The protocol bans mining indefinitely, but there is a complex revision clause which can be invoked in 2048. But it's not a given that revision would make mining allowable. But in terms of this sort of, is it a guise for claiming? It depends how cynical one wants to be, but in a sense, all scientific work throughout the world that isn't in your own country has some kind of geopolitical aspect to it. There's, a lot of literature now which shows that, some of the major advances in geophysics in the 1950s and 60s all relied on the fact that the two superpowers wanted knowledge of the Earth environment so that they could project their militaries through it. I mean, we have plate tectonics now, arguably because of the data gained through these activities. That's a very simplistic way of putting it, but it's not untrue. I suppose the other way I'd like to reframe that kind of, are China and Russia just faking their science? I mean, that's to put it very in a particular framing. I mean, my response would be that Russia has been doing exceptional science in Antarctica since the 1950s. Things we know about the Antarctic ice sheet, the Soviet Union, Soviet scientists and Russian scientists contributed fundamentally to our knowledge of the Antarctic ice sheet. Full stop. China also is doing really important scientific work. I go to these Antarctic conferences where I see their scientists present. Clearly, somewhere like Russia, especially in the 90s, fall of the Soviet Union, of course, scientists are operating with much lower budgets. They really can't compete with, the huge budgets of other countries. But China is, sort of doing that now. China is a rising scientific power, and we can't sort of gainsay that. We can't sort of doubt that the work they're doing is important and does contribute to the standing knowledge of Antarctica. One thing I didn't mention was to differentiate China and Russia is that China has a much stronger articulation that Antarctica is part of the global commons or the common heritage of humanity. These ideas emerged in the 1960s and 70s from, newly decolonized states, sort of anti-imperial states. And I think that especially the territorial claimants in Antarctica, but countries like the United States can often still hold certain views which we would call imperialistic, but which China, you might say, wouldn't make a claim because it does believe so much in this anti-imperial rhetoric that it's less contentious in Antarctica because of the nature of the territorial compromise that you might call it the common heritage of humanity. So you don't need to claim territory if it's available to you anyway. It does become more problematic in the Arctic, of course. China tries to push the common heritage idea for the Arctic a bit more than Arctic countries would like, because, of course, the Arctic is sort of the inverse of the Antarctic, that it is, one, it's an ocean surrounded by land, but also that, territory and sovereignty is essentially uncontested in the Arctic. So that's where China and Russia, I think, that's one way of, trying to prise them apart. They're not just they're not in concert together as nefarious actors. They do have, especially the global commons idea, I would say, is a fairly positive vision of global space.
You spoke about in your article, I think it was in Inside Story, about Rosgeologia and Russia's Geological Survey, that they confirmed that they were looking for oil and gas. I hope I'm correct about that. So could you say a little bit about the significance of their confirmation that was what they were looking at? How do you interpret that open confirmation of that aim?
Sure. Well, I think we all got the news from, a single Russian press release or media release. So there hadn't been much detail on the bones of that announcement, it seems. Certainly, I would say that I'm not so worried about it. I'm generally skeptical around these issues of oil and gas exploration. And I'll explain why. Because oil and gas has been on the Antarctic agenda since the late 1960s. I mean, to contextualize that, oil is discovered in Alaska's North Slope, in the high Arctic, in the late 1960s. So there has been a sense all along that, even if it's a distant prospect, that there is a certain amount of technological capacity or possibility to actually get oil and minerals out of Antarctica. But we've been talking about this since the 60s, and nothing has ever come of it. And there, of course, have been many reasons for this. There continues to be much more accessible oil everywhere else in the world, which means it's cheaper to extract, and therefore cheaper for the consumer. I think we also need to put these kinds of one-off events into like a larger temporal context. So I've just been looking backwards, but to look forwards, I mean, is it likely that oil drilling will begin in Antarctica in the next 10 years? No. I mean, I'm prepared to stake my career on that claim, I suppose. In the next 30 years, well, maybe. But then we need to begin to contend with the fact that we are ostensibly trying to create a low-carbon, zero-carbon economy. So in 30 years' time, when we may have run out of oil somewhere else in the world, which might vaguely lead to Antarctica, will there even be a need to drill Antarctica? So I think when we talk about these kinds of, small glimpses that people are looking for oil and gas in Antarctica, we need to really think thoroughly about the timelines involved and what that means actually in 30 years' time. There is, I think, a slightly different issue. I mean, the Russian announcement this year was about offshore oil and gas, but there is a slightly different issue with onshore minerals, hard minerals. I mean, our climate discourse is really focused on carbon emissions rather than, for example, actually needing to reduce our use of actual material things, though we will get there someday where we have to stop using things, which requires digging things out of the ground. So that is still, I think, a distinct issue. I mean, this could be sort of the segue to another issue, but I and others, and I suppose I follow more seasoned security commentators here, I think the real issue in the near future, the next 5 to 10 years, is what we call dual-use technologies. That is, the Antarctic Treaty demilitarizes the continent. But what happens when Russia and China and the US, we should include in this, for example, install satellite tracking stations in Antarctica, which could be used for global military purposes? So, there are GPS, for the US, there are GPS tracking stations in Antarctica. And in recent years, both the Russian and Chinese systems have also extended to Antarctica. These are systems with civilian uses, undoubtedly, and really importantly. But of course, they have military uses. And so I think that's a more significant area of tension that might undermine the treaty, not mining. And the other is the other resource issue, which I've alluded to already, but it's around fishing. I think fishing is a bigger resource, a more significant area of resource conflict and conflict in general in Antarctica over the next 10 years. China is growing as a fishing nation in Antarctica. It might surprise listeners to know that I believe Norway is still the largest fishing nation in Antarctica. But of course, we don't get angry about Norway, exploiting the world's resources, even though, a Norwegian company is at the center of exploiting krill and devising ever more fancy technologies to get the krill out of the ocean more quickly and at greater volume. And Korea is another really significant fishing nation in Antarctica. Within the context of Kamilar, if China sees that, for example, the krill quota isn't high enough, we're not there yet, and I think it'll be several years. But China, as well as Norway and others, are bringing new ships online to exploit Antarctic fish specifically, to extend the available season they can be in Antarctica. Because, of course, fishing is limited to the summer when the weather is better and there's no ice or less ice. So I do think in those areas, sort of dual-use technologies and fishing quotas and fisheries issues, those are much more likely to be areas of conflict within the system than, a very distant and dim prospect of oil and gas exploration.
So just to sign us off, it's certainly not your expert opinion that we should despair about the future of Antarctica, nor is there anything inevitable about the exploitation and extraction of all its resources and the destruction of its natural climate.
Yes, I would say that, despair is a very debilitating emotion and state to be in. And so I certainly don't think we should be overly pessimistic. Though, I should end with a few notes of caution, of course, that, we can't talk about anything this year of all years and not wonder how COVID will change dynamics in the short or long term. And I don't think apart, in a very just material sense, that COVID is disrupting scientific programs this summer in Antarctica. And some countries I think all countries have scaled back to some extent, but, they all have a lower presence this year. And I'm not sure if we've got to a new equilibrium yet. I mean, I'm sitting here in Australia where trade tensions with China are really ratcheting up in a very distinct and it seems novel way. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Australia-China relationship, but from my impressions of sensible actors in this area, not the more hardline actors who would love to see China, trounce in some way, it is hard to see how those trade tensions will flow through in other bilateral and multilateral arenas. I mean, there's a very specific way in that several years ago when he visited Australia, Xi Jinping went to Hobart to talk about how China could could join with Australia in Antarctic work. And Hobart, whose economy is, really strongly focused around research, marine research and Antarctic research now, was, really hoping that for years to come, the Chinese would base themselves out of Hobart, as a staging post for Antarctica. That might not be happening. That being said, I think it's always worth keeping in mind that Antarctica is not the centre of global geopolitics. I don't want to diminish my own area of research, but there is a certain way in which the Antarctica is a periphery and that there are much more important hotspots. The Arctic, arguably, will be the polar region which has to face these issues more urgently and imminently than Antarctica. But again, it's a very distinct system there. So, they're not completely equivalent. I've recently been trying to ensure that a different framing of our modern moment gets out there, which is that a lot of security studies people can, talk about what are the threats coming from Antarctica. What threat do we need to expect from China in Antarctica or Russia in Antarctica? And I think it is just so important to insist that the threat is to Antarctica. Global human emissions are heating the atmosphere and endangering the literal existence of the Antarctic ice sheet and the ecosystems around it. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And I think that links to another point, which is that I think we need to sort of desecuritize the discourse around Antarctica. I mean, I don't know. I'm enough of a postmodernist that I agree with the literature that's been around since the 90s, which says that if we frame something as a security issue, it will become a security issue. So I think there are ways of framing and talking about Antarctica now that should diffuse and deflect this kind of ratcheting up of geopolitical tension, especially by the community of analysts and think tank people, that I think that, we can just rush in rather than try to think about how we can protect the Antarctic environment and deflect issues elsewhere. I mean, in thinking about your questions, the one point I suppose that we can finish on is the sort of the hypothetical of, although I do think the ATS is relatively stable in the near term, let's say the next decade, can we imagine some state actors leaving the ATS whilst a large rump stay in it? I haven't really seen much consideration of this scenario, but we see in lots of other realms in which China and Russia are kind of creating alternative global systems, whether around economic and financial issues. We even talk about the internet. There are multiple internets now. In the 90s, no one would ever have thought of multiple internets, but we do live in a world in which the internet is not actually truly global. I mean, that's a bit of a stretch, but if we did see China or Russia leaving the ATS, which I'm very doubtful, how would other countries react? Would they, try to concentrate on the system and renew it? How would they deal with, the very nuts and bolts issues of logistical cooperation? If the Chinese icebreaker got stuck in the ice one season and it wasn't in the Antarctic Treaty System, would the Australian icebreaker go to help it? This currently happens now. These are matters of life and death. And so, there's a very high level of cooperation in this. But how would the system react if one or two major actors, I'm not talking about small actors, Czechia or Turkey, if China or Russia pulled out, what would we do? How would that affect governance in Antarctica? Would we have several systems or just one system with rogue actors? So, yeah, I think those are ways of adding a bit of pessimism into the discussion, but they're worth thinking about.
Once again, thank you, Dr. Antonello.
It was a pleasure to join you.